Understanding Genesis, a series of programs for the entire family featuring many of the world's leading creationist speakers. They will answer your questions about creation and evolution and will demonstrate that the book of Genesis is reliable and vitally important.
Now we come to one of my favorite subjects, I suppose. When do fossils exist? Present or past? Okay. You got that down. The fossils exist only in the present. But on the other hand, fossils are the closest we can come to historical evidence. The evidence exists in the present, to be sure, but these are dead things, buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth, like this little dead thing I've got roped around my neck here. And at least we agree that these are dead things that did die in the past. And so we're interested in what kind of stories we can tell about the past from these dead things that were buried back then, these fossils. And so in that sense, fossils are the closest we can come to historical evidence when we take a look at the origin and history of life on Earth. Fossils are also an enormous amount of family fun. And so if you're looking for something to do with brothers and sisters, nephews and nieces and things like that, may I recommend fossil hunting. My own family and I, that's 2 rockhounds and 4 pebble pups, have collected fossils about half a ton from actually all over the world now. We have some quite nice specimens from Australia here, as well as North America, and a few from England and Sweden and so on. And it's really, it is something that's fun to do, and it's an area where amateurs can make a really major contribution. And so if you get interested in some of these things and you're looking for a hobby, suggest fossil hunting. If you know a little bit about what to look for, you may be the one that stumbles across a fossil of major significance. And this is an area where you still can do things like that. Okay. Well, back in the 1800s, when interest in evolution first got started, no one knew what we were going to find when we dug up fossils around the Earth. And so at this point, it would have been kind of, been more interesting in a sense, more risky, you might almost say, to be a creationist in the present time. We didn't really know what we were going to find. If God created living things to multiply after their kind, then we would expect to find separate kinds of life as we look at their fossil remains. We'd expect to find them complete, no in-between parts or so. We'd expect to find them just as complex as fossils as they are at the present time. We'd expect to find them classified according to the same criteria we use today, because they would just be varieties, variations of the created kind. If evolution were true, though, you'd expect to find blended kinds, linked kinds, things that would be blurred, the distinction we have between the various kinds of life on the earth today. You'd expect to find them with incomplete parts, a leg that was on its way to becoming a wing but hadn't quite made it yet, or a flipper that was on its way to becoming a leg and hadn't quite made it yet. You'd expect to find them very simple to start with, thrown together by time and chance. And you'd expect our present criteria of classification not to work at all as you dug back further in the rock layers, as you went from the separate kinds back to the common ancestors that blurred all these characteristics together. So certainly creationists and evolutionists had dramatically different ideas of what kinds of living things would be found as fossil remains. Well, let's take a look then at what we did actually find with these expectations in mind. First of all, let's take a look at the animals without backbones. And the picture you have here, of course, as this fellow assures us over in America, who advertises Australia so effectively, you're going to get wet if you come to Australia. The place is an island. It's surrounded by water. And it's also, I cut out a little clipping from the newspaper before we came over. It has the most poisonous fish, most poisonous snakes, most poisonous everything of any continent. But most of you have been to the beach at some time in your life, and you've probably seen many of the creatures that you see here. A starfish, a snail, a brachiopod, a lamp shell, a sea urchin, a little thing full of spines, a jellyfish in the background, some sponges over here, segmented worm down here, some coral that they're sitting on, and one of the members of the squid and the octopus group, and this particular one, a nautiloid. Down on the coast of South Australia, there are all these cuttle bones that wash up on shore just by the thousands. And so these are all animals that are familiar in Australian waters, just as they are around certain regions in North America as well. When you look at these particular organisms here, you recognize, of course, that these are separate and complex kinds, that these particular animals are like the ones that live on the earth at the present time. They're just as complex as the ocean life living on the earth at the present time. And yet these are the animals whose fossils we find, for instance, in Grand Canyon back in America. In fact, every spring we have a class of field trips, several field trips, that go on a backpacking trip in the Grand Canyon. It took a lot for me to decide not to give that talk and give some others instead. But by the way, might just want to invite you. We're trying to work up an Australian contingent. If you'd ever wanted to go to America, well, next spring you can not only go to America, but you can crawl down inside America in Grand Canyon, look for fossils and tour the Southwest and all that. And so we find fossils of these various kinds of life on these backpacking trips in the Grand Canyon. Now, if evolution is true, where would you find fossils of animals like this? Well, these are separate and complex kinds, look like the kinds of life we have on Earth today. They should be just in the upper layers of rock after millions of years of evolution. These don't look anything like the simple beginnings of life. But where do you find the fossils of animals like this? Answer, at the bottom of the flat-lying layers in Grand Canyon. In fact, evolutionists call the animals that you see in this scene here members of the Cambrian geological system, the trilobite seas, the simplest community of living organisms to leave an abundance of fossil remains. And look at that. These are supposed to be the simplest beginnings of life, the first forms of life to leave an abundance of fossil remains. And what do we find? Complex and separate forms of life. It's life that classifies just like we do today. It looks like an explosion of complex forms of life like this. Anybody here like to scuba dive? Ah, good. I like to do that on occasion. Don't get as much chance as I'd like. Imagine that you were going scuba diving off the coast of Australia or the coast of North America now, and then imagine that you could go scuba diving back when the trilobites were alive. One of those animals that I mentioned in the scene back here is that little animal that I've got, this dead thing tied around my neck. Let me go back to that for a moment. This trilobite here. And this little animal, and this is a real one right here from Indiana, belongs to the arthropod group. It has a hard little crusty shell. It has a compound eye like a grasshopper, except it's got such an elaborate compound eye that it has a lens correcting for underwater vision. The math necessary to describe that eye wasn't even invented until the mid-1800s. And so as my prof in paleontology told me, even though he was an evolutionist, never let anybody tell you a trilobite is a simple animal. It's more complex than the members of that group that exist today. But it seems they're extinct. Now, so far, we haven't staked out an observer at every point on the Earth looking in every direction to know for sure, but we don't know of any living ones at the present time. And yet, marvelous adaptation. We do think maybe there are some. A lot of things that were thought to be extinct have been dredged up. So in that sense, when you take a look at this simple community of organisms, simple in quotes, you not only find everything we have in the oceans today, you have lots more besides the trilobites. You have thousands more species of lamp shells back then than you do now. So if you went on that scuba diving trip that I was talking about and you took a look at the life on the Earth at the present time, and then somehow were able to get in this time machine and go back when the trilobites were abundantly alive in the ocean, and you took a look and you compared ocean life then with ocean life now, what would you say? Boy, oh boy, look at all the evolution that has occurred. Look at how much bigger and better things have gotten. Look at all the new forms of life. Look at the more complicated forms of life. No, it wouldn't be that at all. If you were able to go scuba diving when the trilobites were alive and compare that with what you see in the oceans today, you'd say, what happened? When I was here when these trilobites were alive, there were thousands of species of lamp shells, 10,000s of species of trilobites. There were all kinds of these nautiloids, some with long cone-shaped shells, some with coiled shells, some with curved shells. Now there's just one left, the pearly nautilus. What happened? Where did everything go? Instead of a record of upward-onward progress, the fossil record for these animals without backbones is an explosive, sudden appearance of complex kinds in a full range, everything that lives on the Earth at the present time, and more. So it looks like creation followed by catastrophic extinction. Something happened that wiped out a lot of the forms of life that used to live in the ocean and so on. Could that be the monumental changes that occurred at the time of the flood? It would make it very hard even for some ocean animals to survive. And so it's exactly the opposite of what you'd expect on the basis of evolution. In fact, the whole fossil record is exactly the opposite of what you'd expect on the basis of evolution. Who knew that? You know who knew that better than any scientist at his time? Charles Darwin. As I mentioned, Charles Darwin was very much aware of adaptation as a difficulty with his theory. Charles Darwin also knew what we knew about the fossil record back in the 1800s. In his chapter on the fossil evidence is not titled Evolution, the Evidence of the Fossil Record. Instead, it's called The Imperfection of the Geologic Record. And Darwin knew what we know at the present time. He knew about the absence of intermediate varieties, missing links between kinds, as Ken mentioned. The one thing we know about missing links for sure is they are missing. Okay, they're missing in their millions and so on. And Darwin knew about that. Even in his time, a lot of fossils had been discovered, but nothing in between. They all classified according to modern criteria. He knew about the sudden explosive appearance of fossils, and they started off complex. A modern alternative, by the way, is that life was seeded on the Earth from outer space. Life didn't evolve on Earth. It evolved on some other planet, and it evolved into intelligent life forms. It's packaged up the, quote, seeds of life on the head of a rocket ship and fired it in our general direction. That's why life begins with this explosion. That idea, by the way, belongs to Francis Crick, who got the Nobel Prize for his part in discovering DNA structure. And yet he's had to admit there's no evidence that life could or did evolve on this planet. It had an explosive, complicated beginning. And so he just tries to push the problem back to another area. Well, Darwin knew that too. And he knew about their sudden appearance in the lowest known fossil Bering Strait. Intermediate links, something halfway between this, that, and the other. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, the fossil evidence is the most obvious and serious objection that can be urged against the theory of evolution he was proposing. Sometimes it's kind of fun to play around with news people. Not often, but sometimes. And so I was at a university somewhere, and somebody came up, and stuck a microphone in my face and said, they were going to interview me. So, what do you think about the fossil evidence? I said, I think Charles Darwin was exactly right. Oh, she said, excuse me, I thought you were the creationist. I said, I am. Oh. At least it gets you to stay and ask another question, And so Darwin actually recognized that the fossils were an obvious objection to evolutionary theory. Yet many Christians have been so browbeaten into thinking fossils and evolution go hand in hand that some Christians believe fossils are fakes. Do you know anybody like that? I've met several people, Christians, that their parents tell them they're just made up out of plaster, they don't really exist, it's all a hoax to test your faith and all that. And yet what we know about fossils really supports the idea of creation. In fact, when you take a look at the title, Darwin himself recognized that there was a conflict between the fossil facts in his evolutionary theory. Something has to go. Either the theory is wrong or the facts are wrong. Darwin decided the facts were wrong, threw out the facts and kept the theory. Now, normally a scientist doesn't do that. But Darwin thought he had a legitimate reason to do that in this case because back in 1859, very little was known about fossils. So he said the fossils are just incomplete, imperfect. If we just look long enough and hard enough, we will find the missing links required to support the theory. Well, we're now about 120 years after Darwin wrote those words. A knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. That last little paragraph was not me speaking directly. It was a direct quote from David Ralph at the Field Museum in Chicago when he wrote that. And here's a man whose museum houses 20% of all known fossil species. And that was his point of view. Even as an evolutionist, he says, boy, we can't use that argument anymore. We now have a rich knowledge of the fossils that were out there. Darwin said we had hardly any examples of evolution. How can we have even fewer examples? And Ralph goes on to explain, by that I mean some of the classic cases of Darwinian change. Listen to his example, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. A lot of the examples, that was what Colin Patterson meant, that he learned evidences of evolution have all had to be debunked. dropped from the list and so on. In fact, if you look at the overall pattern, never mind, just a fossil here and there, if you look at the overall pattern, take a look at what Alfred Romer had to say about that, the general picture. And if you look at it with the ordinary tools of science, logic and observation, the overall pattern of the fossil record, if you just look at the overall picture reasonably, it's consistent with the idea of special creation. Now, Romer didn't believe it for a moment, but he was at least honest enough to say that would be the logical inference from the evidence we have, especially when it comes to the most abundant of all the fossils, the animals without backbones. The same thing is true when it comes to plants. And so when you take a look at the plants, you may have wondered what kind of plants did the dinosaurs tromp around on. Well, these would be very familiar in America: oak, magnolia, willow, sassafras, palm, all the regular kinds of flowering plants. And I assume there were several varieties of gum trees in there as well. So when you take a look at these and you ask, where did flowering plants come from? It looks like they just came into being, the full range, instantly. When you find them, you classify them in the same groups we have today and so on. Darwin called the origin of flowering plants, quote, an abominable mystery, unquote. Professor Corner at Cambridge University, even though he's an evolutionist, said, I still think to the unprejudiced, if there were such, to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of special creation. And so again, even though they don't want to agree with our belief system, they certainly don't want to look at what the Bible has to say about these things, they have to admit that the evidence itself really seems consistent with the idea of special creation. But then we come to the vertebrates, the animals with backbones, and all of a sudden, the story takes a different turn. And so now you know what I'm talking about. All of a sudden, we begin to run into some missing links that have been found. One in particular. It used to be when I taught evolution and students would come up to me and say, if evolution is true, where are all the missing links? The type, religious, fundamentalist, uninformed, fanatic. And they'd say that to me and I'd say, glad you asked that question about missing links. It just so happens we have a perfect example. And the example that I told them about was the same one that I'd been taught, the same one that's in every evolution book, every biology and geology book, Archaeopteryx. A perfect example of a missing link showing how reptiles evolved into birds. Well, now there are only two really good specimens of Archaeopteryx, one in Berlin and one in London. And the Berlin specimen looks like this, with the head kind of tilted back and so on and so forth. Reconstructed in the same position, it would look like that. And you say, well, gee, it has feathers, it has wings, it has a bill, it's a bird. What's all the fuss about? But if you look at the bones themselves, you find that there are teeth in the bill. There's no keel on the sternum, like you have in a turkey or a chicken where there's this great big thing down the middle and so on. There's a long bony tail of unfused vertebrae. There are little claws on the wings. Those are things we ordinarily find in reptiles and not in birds. And so there you have it. A perfect example of a missing link that's been found, a transition form between reptiles and birds. So I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you about creation. I did the best I could. What am I going to say? The thing really does seem to be real, although there's been some doubt about that recently. But let's take another look. Okay, now true enough, there are no living birds that we know of anyway that have socketed teeth, but there are several fossil birds that have teeth. And when you stop to think about it, there are some reptiles that have teeth and some, like the turtle, that don't. Some amphibians have teeth and some don't. As Dr. Gish likes to say, some of you have teeth and some don't. And the point is that's not at all crucial in classifying reptiles and birds. What about the claws on the wings? The ostrich has claws on the wings that are, quote, more reptile-like than those of Archaeopteryx. So do the Hoatzin and Turaco. So claws on the wings don't make something more of a reptile and less of a bird. It's simply distinctive of certain kinds of birds. The keel on the breastbone, that's helpful for if you're going to take off fast. But you don't need it for powered flight at all. The real test for powered flight is, do you have a furcula? Okay, what's that? That's what we call in America wishbone. Do you call it that over here? It's a little V-shaped thing, and sometimes you can wish on the end and break it. I forget who wins, the guy with the short end or the long end. But that's a furcula or wishbone, and that's where the muscles attach for the power stroke in flight. Now that's one bone all birds have and no reptiles have, and Archaeopteryx has that wishbone or furcula. In fact, it has, quote, an extremely robust furcula, very powerful one. And then again, it has feathers. If you're talking about this as a missing link, you might say, well, wait a minute. If this is a missing link, where are the stages between scales and feathers? Archaeopteryx has fully developed feathers, in fact, of many different types. The primary flight feathers have the shaft toward the leading edge, a characteristic of strong flyers. Put that together with that robust furcular wishbone, and most scientists have now concluded that Archaeopteryx was a powerful, strong flying bird, not at all something that just glided or limped along or something like that. And you may ask too, well now, what about the transition from leg to wing? Where do we see that in Archaeopteryx? Is that a missing link? Not at all. Archaeopteryx has fully developed, fully functional wings right from the word go. And so really just in the last few years, scientists in the evolutionary community have finally concluded Archaeopteryx isn't a missing link at all. It's just a special kind of bird. No different from one bird, no more different than any other one bird is from another. And one of the real evidences is now, of course, is that modern birds have been found further back or deeper in the rock record than the bones of Archaeopteryx. A few years ago, in 1977, dinosaur Jim Jensen, the fellow who found some big dinosaurs, found the bones of regular birds deeper in the rock layers than Archaeopteryx. And then, just last month, a group out in Texas unearthed a whole bunch of these things, regular bird bones, and so that was the way they put it. Archaeopteryx is off the list. You have regular, ordinary type birds existing before Archaeopteryx exists in the rock record. And yet this is still one. It'll be in textbooks and you'll hear about it and so on for years and years, even though professional evolutionists don't believe it anymore. One of the ones who doesn't believe it anymore is John Ostrom at Yale University. He says, you're right, Archaeopteryx is just a bird, no big deal. Says the real ancestor, the real missing links between reptiles and birds is not Archaeopteryx, it's Proavis. Okay, now that doesn't mean the first car rental company. This is refers to a certain kind of lizard. And here's his idea, and at least you got to give him credit for coming up with a little bit better idea here. He says birds started off as small dinosaurs that ran around on two legs, catching insects with their hands. Okay, so that's how it starts. And then Zots, that cosmic ray again, a mutation happens in one of these small dinosaurs. And so on one of these things, it was born with frayed scales on the front of its hands, kind of the ugly duckling scenario. Okay, and here, you know, the mother almost pecked it to death. It looked so ugly, and the brothers and sisters wouldn't have anything to do with it. But when the family went out jogging looking for insects like this guy'd reach around to grab insects, and these frayed scales kind of made an insect net. And so he was catching more insects than anybody else, which meant what? He got more food than anybody else, fitter to survive, more likely to survive, pass on this gene, and as the millions of years roll by, pretty soon everybody's got these frayed scales on the end like that. So you have an evolutionary step forward, but notice it was just a little step. See, there's much better evolutionary theory. You didn't go from scale to feather, you went from scale to frayed scale. And you didn't start flying, you just started catching more insects to start with. It's good stirring stuff. Okay, and then Zots, another cosmic ray. Just by chance, nobody could anticipate it, and the frayed scales got more frayed and really began to stretch out. Now when the thing's out there jogging around looking for insects, an insect starts to fly away, jumps up after it. That's how flight began. Okay. Well, you have to admit that's a little bit better than the old theory. According to the old theory, flight started with animals that would try to jump out of trees or off cliffs. You know, well, here goes nothing. Splash. So this, it wasn't quite as much of a risk. You just jump up after insects like this. Now, this is a good story. This is serious, by the way. I am talking. You're not taking this seriously enough. At one of the debates that Duane Gish and Dr. Morris had back in America, there's now an official evolutionary debating team that anytime anybody agrees to debate, they call them up and say, look, we'd like to do the debate for you. They've got this real slick slide presentation, everything like that. And at one point, you know, in their rebuttal, they'll say, the creationists say there are no missing links. There are plenty of missing links. Here's one, punch. And up comes Proavis. They don't use Archaeopteryx, but they use this one. And so I mentioned this. Somehow, I don't know how in the world I was ever got doing this, but I was actually talking about Avis with a group of school children, kindergarten to grade 4. Why? I don't know. But somehow I got onto this, and so I just asked the young people out there, I said, do you see any problems with this theory? and hands shot up all over the room. Now, I thought there was a couple problems with it, but I asked one person, I said, what problem do you see? And he said, well, why does Proavis have little chicken feet? I thought, hey, that's interesting. That's one way you don't have to evolve bird feet because you start with bird feet. That was kind of clever. He said, how come the feathers are on the tail out here? Because they didn't use them to catch insects. I thought, that's kind of an interesting idea. But then it got more interesting. One person said, well, look how big the feathers are. He catches insects out there. He says he can't get at them. I hadn't even thought about that. And then the real clincher, one little person, just about so tall, their feet that far off the floor, said, if it jumped up to catch the insects and reached around to grab them, wouldn't it crash down to the ground? I hadn't even thought of that. And so that's a good one. And John Ostrom at Yale University, who thought up this idea, did say there were a couple of problems. And one was the muscle action to reach around and grab things is the opposite of the muscle action need to push the air in flight. So it's actually wired up wrong. You'd have to unlearn this in order to learn how to fly. But even more importantly, John Ostrom says this, no fossil evidence exists of any such Proavis. Nothing like this has ever been found. You haven't even ever found any frayed scales. Scales and feathers preserved. We've got lots of scales. We've got lots of feathers. Of course, bones preserved very well. We've got lots of legs and we've got lots of wings, but we don't have a half scale, half feather. We don't have a half leg, half wing. No fossil evidence exists of that. It's a purely hypothetical pre-bird, but one that must surely have existed. Okay, why must it surely have existed? Notice if we were insisting that only science could be presented in a science classroom, could Ostrom present this idea in a science class? He couldn't even present it, could he? Because it's based on evidence that doesn't exist. It's not a logical inference from anything that's been found. It's a mechanical monstrosity. It's not a logical deduction from the principle of science. It's just his belief that birds had to evolve from reptiles. And since Archaeopteryx did do it, it must have been something like this. Now, Christians, we need not faith that strong, I guess I should say. It's absolutely amazing. If Christians had that much faith and were willing to put it into practice, maybe we could turn the world right side up again. But as far as the evidence is concerned, birds have always been birds, reptiles have always been reptiles, and nothing in between has ever been found. You might wonder, where did the idea of in-between forms come from in the first place? Stephen Gould at Harvard University gives us the answer to that, and he is not a creationist by any means. He's got an award for being the world's leading anti-creationist, but he put it this way: phyletic gradualism, the idea of gradual change, mutation, natural selection, gradually changing reptiles to birds and so on, was never seen in the rocks. That's what Darwin said. I don't see any evolution when I look at the fossils. Nobody else sees any either. When they look at the fossils, when they look between the fossils, they see the evidence for evolution. Where did the idea of gradual evolution come from? It expressed the cultural and political biases of 19th century liberalism. That's what's been taught as the fact of evolution for the last century or more, the cultural and political biases of 19th century evolution. Well, again, if the evidence is as clear and simple as I'm suggesting it is, then even scientists who are evolutionists would recognize the evidence that I've just mentioned, and they do. One is a colleague of Stephen Gould, Niles Eldredge. This is a review of a book that just came out in the Brisbane Sunday Mail just last Sunday, September 14th. And the writer talks about the origin of species. The book, in fact, explained nothing of the kind. As I mentioned, never talked about origin of species. And he says the problem in evolution has always been evidence. Isn't that interesting? The theory's always been good. It's been the evidence that's been the problem. And Eldredge's theory, a simple fact that rather than fossils showing gradual change, they show absolute stability. Things stay the same rather than changing from one form to another. And Eldredge actually says he works in a field in which he admits scientists often ignore the facts that contradict their theories. Isn't that interesting? And so bigotry that marks evolutionists are word. By the way, I recommend this book. It's Niles Eldredge. This is Time Frames, isn't it? This particular book by Eldredge. And yet listen to the summary he's got down here. Indeed, he says, the only competing explanation for the order we see in its biological world, this pattern of nested similarity, that homology and so on, that links up absolutely all known forms of life, the only competing explanation is the notion of capital S, capital C, special creation. That a supernatural creator, using a sort of blueprint, that plan in the mind of God, simply fashioned life with its intricate skein of resemblances passing through it. And so he recognizes what I'm talking about here, even though he chooses to remain an evolutionist. And he's not alone. A whole community now of evolutionists has begun to recognize the same sort of thing. This was the popular summary of that 1980 Chicago conference in Newsweek for November 3rd of 1980. Notice how it starts. The missing link between man and the apes. And human origins will be a subject for tomorrow. But the missing link between man and the apes, whose absence? Right? It's still absent, and I'll show that even in more detail tomorrow. But whose absence has comforted religious fundamentalists or any Bible-believing Christian. They have to admit that, the missing link has not been found. But it's merely the most glamorous of a whole hierarchy of phantom creatures. And that's just what you had in school too, wasn't it, when it came to evolution and fossils. It says evolution is an idea based on phantoms, ghosts, figments of the imagination. No, they don't say that, do they? And yet that's all it is. It's a space between the fossils that's supposed to provide the evidence of evolution. Missing links are the rule, not the exception, but the rule. The more scientists have looked for transitional forms between species, the more they have been frustrated. The more they have been frustrated. And then the summary over here I enlarged a little bit so you could read it. And again, this is a summary of evolutionists speaking. Evidence from fossils now, as it always has, points overwhelmingly away from the classical evolution, the classical Darwinism most Americans and most Australians learned in high school. And that's something. Here are the evolutionists themselves that are telling the world we don't believe what's being taught in schools about evolution. We know better. We know there's no evidence in the fossil record for gradual change from one kind to another. By the way, if you've been thinking on donating a plaque to your local school science classroom, that might make a good one. And so they recognize that evidence. Well, if the evidence points away from evolution, what does it point toward? Now, I'd like to suggest it points toward creation. In fact, all the predictions the creationists in the last century have turned out to be true. And that's a real test in science, prediction in advance of observation. The sad news is those same scientists meeting at that conference that recognized that evolution is wrong said evolution is dead, long live evolution. And so they're not giving up on evolution. They're just changing from the old idea of gradual evolution to a dramatic new idea that Ken Ham mentioned to you a little earlier, the resurgence of an idea called the return of hopeful monsters. Okay? Evolution is getting a lot more dramatic than it used to be. If there's no evidence that reptiles slowly and gradually evolved into birds, what does that mean? It means they rapidly evolved into a bird. A mama reptile laid an egg and out-hatched this bird. And the proof is that you don't find any missing links between reptiles and birds. That proved it happened so fast we missed it. Okay? And the very fact we don't find the evidence is proof that it happened that way. And this, by the way, is serious. I have a hard time convincing you of this, but this is Stephen Gould again. And this is the idea that seems to be sweeping the evolutionary world. And it's also made its way down to some children's literature. And so what I have here is a photocopy of a few pages out of a book called The Wonderful Egg. Okay, and this is a book for children. Now, why would I bring a book for children into such an erudite audience as this one here? Well, this is no ordinary book for children. This is a book recommended by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The AAAS is perhaps the largest organization of scientists in the entire world. And so it really is, and how often, it's not very often, that an association of scientists get together to endorse a children's book. So this must be more than an ordinary children's book. It's also endorsed by 3 different educational institute groups. The American Council on Education and Reading Ladders, the Association for Childhood Education International. So we'll assume it has some impact down here as well. The H.W. Wilson Children's Catalog. And so one major scientific organization, 3 major educational organizations go out of their way to endorse this particular children's book called The Wonderful Egg. Are you ready? Shall I turn the page? Okay, well, inside it starts off simple enough. It says a mother dinosaur laid an egg. Okay, kind of a bland beginning. But then it already, on the first page, it gets more exciting. Was it a dinosaur egg? Okay. Now back when children grew up on farms, the answer to that was obvious. Chicks laid chicken eggs, ducks laid duck eggs, and so on. Dinosaurs would lay dinosaur eggs. But this is much more dramatic. Mother dinosaur laid an egg. Was it a dinosaur egg? And then you turn the pages. Was it a brontosaur egg? No, it wasn't a brontosaur. Was it a stegosaur? No, it wasn't that. Was it a tyrannosaur? And it goes on and on through all the different kinds of dinosaurs. And you can see, and then it comes, but no, it wasn't the dinosaur egg at all. Now remember, it was laid by a mama dinosaur. You can imagine a little person, Mommy, turn the page. What was it, one of those? Okay, you turn the page and it still doesn't tell you. It was a wonderful new kind of egg. Okay, it's time to go to sleep. Or, no, don't go to sleep. What was it? Okay, so you turn the page. This was the egg laid by the mama dinosaur. And when it hatched into a baby bird. Okay, the first baby bird in the whole world. And the baby bird grew up to be a beautiful bird with feathers. Okay, this is not just something that's partly bird. Beautiful bird with feathers. The first beautiful bird that ever sang a song. Okay, so it got the vocal equipment and all that at the same time. High, and the wings worked. High in the treetops of the new green world of long, long ago. And so keep in mind, this is being considered very seriously around the world, and this is one of the examples. In the Reader's Digest, there's another example of the same thing when it comes to the origin of land animals. Again, there's never been any evidence that fish slowly and gradually changed into frogs and other kinds of amphibians. And so now you apply this new idea of hopeful monsters to this particular group as well. This is Reader's Digest, an American edition for September of '82, but it's an excerpt from Francis Hitchings' book, The Neck of the Giraffe, and in which he outlines a new modern theory of evolution. The emergence of the first land animals accordingly might be described in these terms. This is how fish evolved into amphibians. It wasn't slow and gradual. There's no evidence for that. But it starts this way. In the wake of a global disaster. Isn't that interesting? It used to be evolutionists never like to talk about global disasters, but now they're thinking they happen every 26 to 28 million years, wipe out everything, give evolution a fresh start. And it all happens under the cover, of so quick that we don't see any of this stuff. In the wake of a global disaster, a large number of amphibious creatures, now these are fish that are going to become amphibians, were thrown up on shore and became stranded. Okay, now get the picture here. Here's a fish swimming around the ocean. All of a sudden, big tidal wave comes, throws a bunch of these fish inshore, and they become stranded. Okay, now that doesn't look like that's, well, let's see what happens. Probably the best sentence in the whole article. Many died. I can believe that well enough. That sounds pretty good so far. But among the surviving mothers of these fish thrown inland in the wake of a global disaster, among the surviving mothers, a strange diet. Yes, I would say so. It's a mouthful of sand when you've been used to swimming in the ocean. Strange diet. Let's see. Exposure to a new climate. Yes. And acquired immunity to diseases led to intense genetic pressure on their unborn young. Okay, it's good stirring stuff, isn't it? The resulting chromosomal changes produced thousands of mutant monsters. So now I've got to get the picture again. These are fish thrown inland in the wake of a global disaster, stranded there with the new diet, stress, and all this. Most of them died, but some of them are giving birth to young, okay, which have chromosomal abnormalities. Okay, the vast majority were stillborn or impotent. I can believe that. But just occasionally, the chromosome change was perpetuated. Okay, after a few generations, several varieties of monsters, okay, these fish born to fish thrown inland in the wake of a global disaster, several varieties of monsters became viable. What does viable mean? Ability to live. After several generations, they developed the ability to live. I'm not quite sure about that. But these were the hopeful monsters, species which then proliferated over a largely unpopulated globe. And so again, good stirring stuff, and it's based on the fact, you might wonder, why would a scientist want to believe something like that? And the answer is the total absence, after 120 years of digging everywhere, that there was ever any evidence of slow gradual change. I think you can also see some problems with the hopeful monster idea. Among the problems are this, of course, chance. What are the chances of getting something like that to happen? But then think of that new bird that hatched out of the reptile egg. Is it singing that song high in the treetops? At first, it's a real happy song, but gradually it gets sadder and sadder and sadder as it looks around and recognizes what? It's the only one of its kind. Well, there's really not much of an evolutionary future in that. There's no way to reproduce at all. And when it comes to chance, another scientist describing this theory refers to these as miracle mutations. And one time I kind of put it this way, evolutionists definitely believe in miracles. They just have a hard time believing in the miracle worker. But it would take a miracle squared and cubed many times to believe something like that. When it comes to the creation side of things, if we look at the evidence from fossils and from the evidence from genetics that we talked about earlier, evolution is based on genetics that have never been observed. We've never seen anything slowly and gradually change from one kind to another. We've never seen anything rapidly jump from one kind to another. It's based on fossils that have never been found. Creation is based on genetics, the laws of science we put into practice every day, and thousands of tons of fossils recovered from all the continents on the earth. And so this is a real test of a scientific theory. Does it predict in advance of observation? And the facts that we observe confirm what we read in the Bible earlier. And so if you take a look at all the stuff that I've talked about this morning, this is a summary I often use at universities and ask the students to think about these things. Our knowledge of DNA, genetics, adaptation suggests that life was created. Our knowledge of genetics, mutation and selection, suggests variation within kind. Our knowledge of the fossil record confirms variation within kind, and as we'll talk about tomorrow, suggests that all of these lived at the same time. Now, in a sense, that's a scientific summary of the case for creation. It's also a Bible lesson. I don't know how many of you see through that, but if I reorganize this in terms of Genesis foundation, this is creation, this is the fall, and this is the flood. And it just organizes our scientific data so fantastically that it really just fits so well. And the Lord has always been good. A lot of times in America, I can't really talk about creation and the Creator directly. Just wait for somebody to ask the question. And as soon as they bring them up, yes, as you mentioned, this happens to point back to what we read in Genesis as well. In fact, if we take a look at the summary of the case for biology, it looks like we're right back to those opening chapters of Genesis. Let's see if I can get this. When we take a look at the fossils, the kind of things we find as fossils, a marvelous fit of living things to their environment, we have evidence of creation. God created things to multiply after their kind, complex to begin with. But of course, fossils are dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. And so in that sense, fossils not only tell us about creation in their complexity and in their separateness and distinctness of their kinds, but they also tell us about the corruption of the created order, the fall. And so they're a record of death and disease and disaster. In fact, the Bible tells us, so filled with violence and corruption did that first world become that God resolved to destroy it and give the world a fresh start with Noah and his family. And that's why we find these fossils stacked up in a layer cake of rock, a mile or a kilometer and a half deep in Grand Canyon, and spreading even thicker in other parts of the world. And so if we take a look at this, you see I never went to seminary, but somebody told me you're supposed to summarize things with letters that all start the same way. So creation, when we take a look at adaptation, the kinds of things that we have as fossils, we find evidence of creation. When we take a look at mutations and natural selection, we find something went wrong with the created order. We have evidence of the corruption that Paul tells us about in Romans 8. When we look at the way those fossils are stacked up in rock layers, we have evidence of that worldwide catastrophe. But praise God, there's 4 C's, not just 3. And the 4th C is the same as first. It's the Lord Jesus Christ himself, who was the Creator, who is the Creator, who is the Word of God, without whom was not anything made that was made. He's the one who continues to care for us. He's the one who's making that new heavens and new earth in which righteousness dwells. He's the one that can make each of us a new creation in Christ right now.
additional information, including a free catalog of creation materials, contact the Institute for Creation Research. Write to Post Office Box 2667, El Cajon, California, 92021, or call 619-448-0900.